Now we turn our attention to Chapter 12, Human Health Risks. And we begin the chapter with a case study of an area in Louisiana, a 4-block square neighborhood, which had a chemical factory at one end and an oil refinery at the other end, both owned by Shell. And they were noticing a lot of air pollution. The air smelled bad. They had 1/3 of the children had asthma, which is a much higher than normal rate. They had higher than average cancer rates and higher than average birth defect rates. And so a grassroots effort, which was led by a middle school teacher, began to try to test the air so that they could prove to the companies that they were responsible for pollutants being put into the air and that those pollutants were harming the residents. And they found that without data, they weren't able to make any difference. So they found a way to collect air samples and have them tested, and it was called the Bucket Brigade. And as a result of their testing, they found that these two companies were putting out 2 million pounds of toxic chemicals into the air each year. 2 million pounds, a lot of air pollution in one little area. So a couple of take-home points from this case study, and one is that this was a grassroots effort. It wasn't led by the EPA or any government agency. A second thing was that the thing that was necessary to make their case was data, and that even with the data, it still took over a decade for the companies to admit liability, but they did. And those residents who wished to be bought out, have their homes bought out so that they could move to a better neighborhood or a cleaner neighborhood, were able to do so. And in addition, Louisiana fined the company for violating their air pollution laws. So it was a success story. It's also another example of environmental justice, where people who were in a lower socioeconomic group were subjected to this air pollution from these companies, and eventually were able to prove that and clean up the air and relocate themselves. So in addition to looking at human health risks throughout this chapter, we'll also look at the cases of environmental justice. Now let's turn our attention to the objectives for this chapter, for this unit. Students should be able to identify and give examples of the 4 major categories of human health risks. Those 4 major categories are physical, biological, chemical, and a 4th one that's not in your textbook, but I've added in here, lifestyle. Lifestyle overlaps physical, biological, and chemical, but I think it's important to consider it. The second objective, identify historically important infectious diseases and emergent infectious diseases. So an infectious disease is something that can be transmitted human to human, or from an animal or insect to a human, or from drinking water or food. And these infectious diseases, there have been some major ones throughout history, which I'm sure you've heard of, such as the Black Plague or bubonic plague. And we have emergent infectious diseases. COVID-19 is an example of an emergent infectious disease. The third objective is name and define the 5 major chemical risks. Those categories for chemicals that cause damage to humans are neurotoxins, things that affect the neurological system, carcinogens, which are things that cause cancer, teratogens, which are chemicals that harm fetuses and embryos, allergens, things that people have an allergic reaction to, such as peanuts, and endocrine disruptors, things that disrupt our endocrine, which includes many different things, but includes the reproductive system. 4. Explain how scientists determine the concentrations of chemicals that harm organisms. How do we know what level is safe or not safe? And they have 2 different types of studies, which we'll go into. LD, which is lethal dose, and that's a concentration at which half of the test organisms die or are killed. So that's a lethal dose. And effective dose means the dose at which something bad, a bad effect is seen, but it's not death. So perhaps the animal is no longer able to reproduce or is having difficulty with breathing or something like that. Doesn't kill them, but they start to see the effect. So both are important considerations that we'll take a look at. Fifth, identify and describe factors other than concentration that affect the toxicity of a chemical. So one chemical can be studied and tested, for example, and it might not be so bad all by itself, but when you put it together with a second chemical, they might act synergistically, which means they act together to cause more harm together than either one alone. So those are some of the types of factors other than concentration that we will look at. And 6, understand and give examples of risk assessment, risk acceptance, and risk management. That's certainly something that we're well aware of right now when we're considering how to manage the risk from COVID. And what are we willing to do? Are we willing to go outside? Is face mask going to be enough? Are you willing to go to work? So different risk assessments have been taking place. People have decided what they can accept and how they can manage it best. Also, there are two philosophies of risk management. One is innocent until proven guilty. If we're not sure that something is dangerous, let's not worry about it. And the other opposite philosophy is the precautionary principle, which is if something looks like it might be bad for our health, then do what we can to eliminate that particular risk.